family skeptical, parenting, not belief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you.
Welcome to the new house.
Welcome to the continued, not struggles, tribulations?
Trials. It feels very biblical.
Yeah. Trials of moving. This may sound different.
We're on a microphone, like a bi-directional microphone set between us. So we're actually looking at each other for the first time instead of being in two separate rooms.
And that's because I tried to improve our sound.
You did.
And in the process, I made every single one of our mics stop working, which was like 4.
So it's going to be a bit of a trial and error, DIY, what have you, for the next
little bit.
Hopefully no more than this podcast. Hopefully we get it sorted out before the next episode is recorded. But we apologize in advance for any weirdnesses, inconsistencies, or otherwise, what have yous.
We're just trying to make it work.
Like parenting.
Yeah. Just like parenting. Our kids haven't stopped working so far. All right. So one thing, a little bit of housekeeping we need to do. If you want to hear more about the Creator Accountability Network, we talked about it a lot on the last episode, but we're in the process of getting credentialed. And as part of this, we need to read this announcement a couple of times on the podcast. So I will do that now. And if you haven't listened to the last one, I encourage you to go back because they're really cool. And we say lots of stuff about them.
And don't just listen to the Creator Accountability Network PSA at the top. Listen to the actual episode.
Yeah. We're excited to announce that we've joined the Creator Accountability Network.
Woo-hoo!
CAN is a nonprofit dedicated to reducing harassment and abuse through ethical education and a system of restorative accountability. We join because we care about the safety and well-being of our community members. If you feel our behavior or content has harmed someone, please report it to CAN, either via the reporting form on their website, creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org, or via their hotline at 617-249-4255. They'll help us make it right and avoid repeating that mistake in the future. CAN also needs volunteers from our communities to help with their process. So if you have skills you think would be helpful, or time and a desire to help, please visit their website to find out how you can volunteer. Most importantly, get the word out to other creators who you think would be interested in getting credentialed. Help us build safer communities together. And that info is also in our episode notes. And if you go to our website contact page, it's there too. So just in case you didn't get all that. Okay. So there were things I wanted to talk about. I think what I wanted to talk about is just how interesting it has been with the kids since the move and how much, I was going to say how much new stuff they've tried, but in some ways, I just think it's been interesting. I feel like I've gotten to see their personalities shine so clearly in the last month. So it's just a whole host of things. But one thing we talked about in the last episode is just how much our folks have helped us in this move.
Yeah.
And one thing I didn't mention, my mom was so amazing when she was out because it was just, as we mentioned, we did not get into our house as quickly as we thought we would.
Nope.
And it was really hard because the kids didn't really have any toys to play with. It was super hot and gross out. So it wasn't really easy to do park stuff, though she did a lot of that too. And, there was just a lot going on. And so she was absolutely amazing, just every day finding stuff for them to do, even though she thought it was going to be different. And one of the amazing things she did is that she took the kids to
the Great Wolf Lodge.
Yes.
For an overnight.
Overnight.
It's like a hotel water park wolf themed. I mean, and there's like a whole magic wand thing. It's very interesting.
But I think it was, I don't even know, well, maybe you thought about it a ton, but I didn't think about it a lot until after they were gone, that this was their first time away from us.
Yeah.
For a night.
Yeah. It was a big deal. They did great, apparently.
Yeah. But like, that was wild because we actually got a date night, which like in the madness of moving, like that was wild. But they did really well, even though it was a period where they had been sort of like at each other's throats a bit, but they did amazing. And it was just intriguing because it's like I wasn't sure how they would do, and they did wonderful. But then my mom offered to do an extra night with them, and Reader still wanted to come back. And I feel like that's just so, it was such an emblematic moment for Reader, because he is both our kid who is so brave and just willing to try anything. So he like spent the entire time going down the biggest slides he possibly could and like trying all the things, but was also the kid who was like, I want to be back with my folks. Like one night is enough for me. And just that kind of dichotomy of who he is. And then Go didn't want to do any of the big slides. And actually his big thing was there was like a magic quest you could do, and that appealed to all of his creative sensibilities. And I feel certain he would have been fine doing another night and like spending the next day doing all magic. But he was okay coming home. And the nice thing was they had like wands and capes and things that my mom got him. And so like that was his go-to toy for the next like couple weeks of the move.
Yeah, it all worked out.
Which was amazing. But it was just like such a clarifying moment of where they are in their lives. And then the other really interesting thing is that where we moved, there is a rock climbing gym. And we knew we definitely wanted to try that just because it's a fun thing to do that we haven't had a chance to do where we were living. And we went, and the boys just fell in love with it. It was, and do you feel like you know why it's been like so, why they took to it so much? Like, did you expect that going in, or was it a surprise? Because they like trying new things, but I don't think I expected them to love it so immediately.
Well, it's sort of a game, and we have 2 gamers. And when you're climbing, there are different routes you can take. And the route you take can change from climb to climb. But in a sense, it's a puzzle. You figure out what you can do, and then you attempt to do it. And then you achieve, you get to the top. And then if you don't get all the way up, you try to do it again. It's very much like you're playing a game. There's an objective, and it's just you versus an object. And you can take it at your own pace. Like with video games, when it's not multiplayer, you have the ability to pause, to redo, to save, leave, try again later. And that gives you a lot of flexibility. If you're looking for an activity that gives you a sense of accomplishment, in which you cede no control, really. And so for especially a kid like Reader, who has dealt with anxiety in a time in which there is a lot of anxiety, potentially or actually, having an activity where he feels like it's a challenge, but it's one that he has control over in its various forms, probably gave him a sense of security in that accomplishment. So I'm not surprised. I didn't anticipate it being as big of a hit, but I definitely am not surprised by how much of a hit it actually is.
And then, do you want to talk about the conversation that Reader had with us? Because I think it was a pretty big deal.
Which conversation was that?
After discovering rock climbing.
Oh, are you talking about wanting to do rock climbing and swimming in lieu of martial arts?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And I had the feels. I used to train for many years and taught for many years and had a school. And so it's like there was part of me that had to move past that pang of, oh, now he's not doing something that I have that immediate emotional and intellectual access to anymore. Now he's doing his own thing, which is fine, which is part of life. It's part of parenting. It's part of being a child. And I'm just really proud that he is as engaged with it as he is, and as motivated to go. And it's also a social activity. Like now we just had a play date where he met up with one of his buddies from school in the neighborhood at the rock climbing place. And so they went bouldering together and, challenging each other, trying different stuff. And it was interesting because he and his friend are built so differently that they necessarily took different routes. They did different things, or the same thing sometimes in different ways. And it was very, let's just say it was an affirmation of everything that I was hoping that he would get out of it. And then also him integrating himself into this new community that is much more of a neighborhood kid community than we had in our previous home. So it was a confluence of positive emotions, but some pangs of regret over which I had no control because I can't force him to like a thing that I like.
And I don't think it's that he didn't like it.
No. It had kind of run its course, and this was a natural point in which he would want to potentially try something new.
And I was so proud of him for being mature enough that he felt like he could come and talk with us.
Indeed.
And let us know what he wanted.
Oh, for sure.
It's just been interesting. So I just feel like everybody is everybody is like being amazing and trying new things and also being so much who they are.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think I told you last night. So, Go loved that Magic Quest.
Yes.
So much. So he keeps bringing it up and asking when we can go back. And last night during reading time, apropos of nothing, Reader was like, "Oh, I don't think it's going to be there next time." I think it was just like,
why wouldn't he just take the moment to be a jerk? Yeah.
And so of course Go lost his mind, was so sad. I had to look it up on the website to make sure it wasn't a temporary thing. I was like, oh man, the most primo Big Brother move.
Yeah.
Just casually. I just see how I can unravel your psyche by just pulling on the smallest thread. And I'm just going to just gently, as if I'm, not doing anything, just give it a little tug. Oh man. So I think we're going to try to keep this one short again, because we're most likely, we're definitely going to be late getting this out. I'm supposed to post this in 2 days, and I feel certain that is not going to happen.
It's okay.
But in the last episode, I conflated 2 different Christian parenting podcasts.
As you do.
Because I mentioned the episode Be Wary of Good Times, which is from the Dad Tired podcast, which, decent name. But when I talked about that podcast, I think I was actually thinking about Truth Love Parent, which is another Christian dad parenting podcast. It's all in the show notes. You can go back and parse it out. But I wanted to talk more about Truth Love Parent because it's an interesting one. I've listened for a while, and it's been pretty kind of middle of the road until recently, when things have just gotten super, it's just gotten very intriguing and kind of gone a direction that I didn't expect. And it is part of Evermind Ministries. And we're going to talk about one episode, but it has only gotten more wild since then. And the reason, there are so many reasons that I am interested in this one. But so it's Truth Love Parent, and the episode is called The Truth and Lies of Developmental Stages. And I made you listen to it because I'm a mean person.
You're not a mean person. I enjoyed listening to it.
What made you enjoy it?
Like seeing how the other half lives. The blissful ignorance of competing worldviews.
I don't know, it didn't feel blissful to me. Is that?
No, just because the words he was saying were very argumentative, sometimes vitriolic, doesn't mean that he himself doesn't find those beliefs underpinning whatever his version of Christianity is to lead to a sort of sense of self through his religious belief that is a security, that his science denial and vilifying difference doesn't also lead him to feel like he is right, and because he's right, he can relax about investigating whether or not he's right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of the problems come from when you're talking to apologists, is because there's a lot of cherry picking and a lot of confirmation bias, right? And a lot of poisoning the well. There's just a lot of fallacies.
Yeah.
And this podcast that he put out is no different. I made a list.
Yeah. So this episode, as you can tell from the title, is about the problems with the developmental stages as described by, is that like
It's not a problem with the developmental stages. It's a problem with the characterization in science and medicine of what developmental stages are and their validity.
Yeah. How he sees that.
Correct.
At least. And
he has objections.
They're not entirely clear.
Oh, no, his objections tend to be rather clear. Are they unfounded? Wait and see.
Hey, it is Moms from the Future. I am hopping in because as I was editing, I realized that Pop's jumping in with his thoughts kept me from running through the stages of development at the beginning of this discussion. And I do get there eventually, but just to clarify, we're talking about Erikson's stages of development. If you've heard of them, the ones that'll probably jog your memory are the baby stage of trust versus mistrust, or the teenage stage of identity versus confusion. But it was really a way of thinking about the different stages we go through as we age and the different psychological qualities that we try to develop along those stages. Also, I wanted to say just at the beginning to make it super clear, I'm not like madly in love with these by any means. As far as I understand, they've been a good framework for understanding a lot of things about human development, but I don't mind if you want to criticize them. When I did some extra reading after the recording, people have pointed out that they may be more culturally specific than we realized. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. But what I more wanted to get into is just that the arguments presented in this podcast from Tooth Love Parent against them are very problematic. And also, just like I can't imagine loving them so much that I couldn't hear any criticism of them, I also can't imagine being as angry as this podcast seems to be about them on the negative side. Last thing I wanted to say is, in a little bit, I'm going to talk about the difference between science and medicine. And it's something I've thought about a lot. I don't know if I quite hit the nuance I wanted to. After the record, I went back and tried to do some more reading about it. And frankly, what I was able to find was, at a philosophical level, my busy brain wasn't even prepared to deal with. But I do think it is an interesting concept. If you think I could have done it better, I definitely agree with you. And if you want to do more reading about it, there is certainly some like very complex, nuanced things out there. So I would encourage you to check those out. I think that's it for now. I'm going to pop in with one more interruption later. So yeah, have fun with that. I mean, so I wanted to listen to this one because my mom has studied child development and actually thinks that like that's something that should be taught in all schools. And I haven't studied the developmental stages a lot, but I've learned a lot from her. And she actually taught, I don't know if it was child psychology or child development, but she was teaching at an art school and it was just an elective. So like she didn't have to
have credentials.
But so she's read a lot about it. And, and I feel like a lot of the best things that she did as a parent in some ways came from that understanding. And so like, I don't know how accurate it all is, but I know like even in the move, when we were planning the move, she reminded me, she's like, this is going to be really hard for the kids. And like, if they revert back to some past behaviors, like that's totally normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what she did that was so amazing is that she didn't try to fight the way the kids are in the way she raised me. She just really tried to do things that would support me doing the best in every situation. So like, and look, I didn't take this advice. When I had a kid, she gave me this amazing box set of cards with like her few pieces of parenting advice. And I was actually thinking about last year, like going through them one by one a little bit. But like whenever we went out to a restaurant, she didn't expect me to just be able to sit still and be quiet and not disruptive. She would like bring things for me to read and activities for me to do. And, understood that like where I was as a kid, it wouldn't necessarily be expected that I would just
sit still and be quiet.
Yeah.
This also, interrupting really quickly, this also highlights the importance not of being a credentialed expert in something scientific for you to be able to wield the benefits of that study and research. Because one of the best parts about science is that when done properly, everybody else in that related field will do their best to hack at it, poke at it, light it on fire, blow it up, and see what's left standing. And so your mother is basically, in reading what she has and going through this vast glut of potential information, has winnowed out the things that work and make sense, clearly. And so even though she isn't credentialed, she is qualified because she is leaning on the research that has been the most vetted. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if new research comes out and she really takes pride in keeping up on these things, that she wouldn't then amend what she's doing, because that's how she got there in the first place.
But because of all of that, I just had a very hard time thinking what part of this would make somebody angry. Like, it just doesn't really seem an obvious thing that would require like a takedown.
Does the subject fly in the face of the person's deeply held religious beliefs? Check.
Well, but does it make sense to you why it does?
His ego is attached to those things that he is objecting to. If for him to affirm the positive qualities of the things to which he is objecting would require him to dismantle the structure connecting his ego to his religious beliefs. And for a lot of people, that is fantastically difficult. He is not alone in this.
Yes.
This is so common. I'm not going to hold it against him. This is clearly like it's a conditioning thing. And you can have that conditioning reversed. It takes effort and humility and self-reflection, which obviously is also difficult, but it can be done. And so I don't know. Let's get into it.
Okay. So do you want to start? I mean, it's interesting because I would say the beginning of his issue with the developmental stages, I would describe as, I don't like science.
My first note was, and I quote myself here, conflation of researchers and practicing clinicians regarding malpractice.
Oh, well, so I really wanted to talk about this.
Which is ridiculous because just to, again, like blurb version, the guy finds fault with all medicine because some doctors in their offices are found to be guilty of malpractice. Therefore, like researchers researching the fields are also suspect because they're practicing medicine, I guess, in some cursory capacity in his fevered mind.
Well, I have to tell you this. Well, and not even malpractice, just the fact that...
Well, that's the word he brought up. Okay. He was bringing up malpractice suits and says some doctors are guilty of malpractice. Therefore, research in the trans is bad.
That's a, yeah. That
I was drinking coffee at the time, and I had to fight spitting it out. It was comically bad.
So I nearly cheered in the section because, so it's malpractice, but also because doctors can misdiagnose patients. Therefore, science, no.
Yeah, I was just the most absurd set of positions.
But I wanted to cheer because this has been my argument for a long time. And I don't think I've made it on the show because I've had no proof. This is my theory. But it proved my theory.
Okay.
So my theory is...
Your hypothesis.
My hypothesis, right, because a theory is a whole different thing. Like I was talking with Go about this night, language is complex, words have different meanings.
Right.
It makes things interesting, but sometimes difficult. So yes, not theory, not in the scientific sense of the term, but in the colloquial, which is what a lot of people think the scientific term is. Anyways, my hypothesis is that most people's closest, like the closest that most people get to dealing with science is dealing with medicine. And they are related, but very different. And a lot of doctors that practice are like, well, one, the body is like just ridiculously complex. It is ridiculously complex. Like all the religious arguments that like we are perfectly made and therefore God, like everything in our body proves that wrong because our body is not perfectly made. It's a big meat sack with a ton of inherent problems.
I'm going to puke out my blowhole.
And like, yeah, like ear hole, food hole next to each other. You think you could have like done a little magic with that. I mean, even like the whole, like the eye is so perfectly designed. I think it was Seth Andrews who had somebody on to talk about like just what like a hellscape or eye design is, how it's like, let's put tons of like shit in between what picks up the signal. And like, anyways, I'll try to find that episode because it's great. But like bodies are ridiculously complex and you can do, and we have done amazing science. Like the advances in medicine are positively wild. If you think about like just 100 years ago, it's mind blowing. Amazing science has been done. But, you know, like doctors only study so much. If something comes in that isn't something they've seen, yeah, they might misdiagnose that. Also, in medicine, like we know doctors are rushed. They don't have enough time with patients. And I also know tons of doctors who like aren't great at listening to patients, like just aren't wonderful people. Didn't take the time to listen. Probably misdiagnosed some stuff because they were like rushing people through, assuming things. People in bigger bodies talk all the time about how they go in and the only thing they're ever told is to lose weight. And doctors won't take them seriously because of all sorts of biases in our culture to like treat the issue they're having and not tell them to lose weight first. So people's, you know, experience of medicine is a really mixed bag. And I think, and my hypothesis has been that that leads into our perception of science. Whereas science is like a very different thing, and particularly research science, like draws on a lot of different skills. And this is the other thing I was going to say. I also think because the body is so complex that like, I don't know, I could be totally wrong about this, but I feel like to be a doctor, you know, like if you were to, there's like the whole stereotype of the, you know, like Doctor Strange in Marvel, who starts out as a surgeon and he just has this wild ego because he's this amazing surgeon and he thinks he can do anything. But I do think, given how hard treating people is and like how all bodies respond differently, my sense is that like a certain number of doctors, like you kind of like they sort of have to develop an ego about their opinion. Because if you were just like open to yourself about the number of things that somebody is going to not react the way you expected, that like it would just be really hard to do that job. You know, I mean, I had an IUD taken out and I went into the doctor and I was like, here are all the things that I have happening. like breast sensitivity. My periods are happening at all sorts of weird times. Like I just ran through this whole list of things. And she was like, your IUD is definitely not causing any of that. Those are not indications of the IUD.
Hey, remember when my lay ass told you to get the IUD out 6 months prior to that?
Yeah.
And then what happened?
And then I was like, cool, noted, take it out anyways. And she did. And I would say 70% of my symptoms like
Within a week.
Went away within a week. But, and that was frustrating. And I think that was partially like her as a, a person. But I think, but I also have some sympathy because it's a really hard job. Like you're dealing with people in these incredibly vulnerable positions and you can't figure it out. Like it has real impacts on people's lives. And it's like, I would never want to be a doctor. That would be terrifying to have somebody's health in your hands. And so I get that, like all people, like I understand the desire to have some like simple answers for yourself and to, anyways. So I just think, but I do think people conflate that within science as a whole. And I think that can lead a lot of people to having a negative view of science in its entirety. Whereas I've worked with some research scientists and that field, so there are certainly exceptions and there are tons of egos. The research scientists I have worked with, very different than a lot of the doctors I've known, are excited by not knowing the answer. Like getting a bad result, like getting a result you didn't expect can be a good thing. It's just like
because that's science.
That's science. It's like
I don't know isn't scary. That's where this guy comes in.
Yeah.
Like this is why this dude, my next point, is like he category errors himself into just absurdity when he puts quote unquote spiritual development in the same basket as like neurological functions and like brain physiology developing. Like your brain physically develops going up to the age of 25, but also he's just like he includes in all of that development spiritual development, and that the spiritual development, if left unaddressed, will not lead to like a proper development of the individual. Therefore, developmental stages bad again.
Yeah, no. So there's the doctors sometimes misdiagnose people, therefore science bad. Also, some scientists think trans people exist, therefore science bad.
Yeah.
And there's also
evolution.
Yeah. Oh scientists believe in evolution, therefore science bad. I'm sure he has other episodes on that. He doesn't.
Please don't make me watch or listen to them.
He didn't feel the need to get into it. That was a given. That's all I know.
They're probably linked in his show notes.
Yeah.
His.
But then, I mean, I think his like biggest claims against the developmental stages were
science changes.
Oh, yes.
Science changes, therefore science can't be trusted. Science claims developmental stages are a thing, therefore developmental stages can't be trusted.
I mean, I don't know if we need to say it, but the fact that science changes
is a good thing.
That's the best.
It's like, imagine a Reuben, but instead of rye bread and Russian dressing and some nice Swiss cheese and some, whatever you're going to put in there, some corned beef or pastrami, some sauerkraut, maybe some extra cheese fried in butter. Instead of all of that, just imagine an array of fallacies squished together and pumped through headphones. This is the Reuben of fallacies.
Yeah. I mean, the reason science changes is that scientists are still working to learn new things.
And they discard things they learn don't work.
Yeah.
Aren't predictive. It's almost like it's doing exactly what it claims to do in the way it claims to do it.
It's amazing.
And by amazing, you mean depressing.
Yeah. But then when he actually gets to the developmental stages, I think one of his big complaints is that, like, he seems to suggest that the science says, like, whatever is happening in a certain stage, you only deal with it in that stage and then move on. And I did check with my mom, who's done a lot more reading, and she's like, yeah, no, that's not what's implied at all. It's not like, like when you become a teenager, like, yes, you're working to pull away from your family and develop more of your own identity, but it's not like you never deal with your identity ever again. That's not implied at all.
I've dealt with my identity more as an adult within the last 6 months than I have in the preceding 20 years.
Yeah. And then I think his other big argument is that I think it has to do with expectation. So I think his worry is that if we realize that children have certain limitations based on their age, that we won't ask them to achieve more or to try more. And there, like, if that's how somebody's applying the science, I do think that could be a bad thing. But again, I don't think there's any implication in any of this that if your child is showing, because it's not like everybody develops at exactly the same pace.
Mm-hmm.
These are broad categories.
Yeah.
That if your child is showing a capability to excel or do more in a certain area, I have certainly never seen anything that's like, no, tamp that down as much as you can. You keep them in that developmental stage. Don't you dare let them do more. I think that is just something he is imagining.
Again, he's picking the cherries and confirming the biases.
Yeah.
Did I mention yet that he conflates humanism and materialism?
Oh, in that one?
That's like the final slice of bread in the Reuben fallacy sandwich. It's just not, no. But I think the long and short of it is, I like hearing those compounding reflections and investigations from people with whom I disagree.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to understand their thought process, which is why when you suggested that you asked me politely, ordered me.
I asked you politely and then I ordered you
to listen to the podcast episode. I initially balked because I'm not a podcast person, ironically. I'm more of a YouTube guy. And thankfully, I have a lot of furniture to build. So that cooked off that podcast listening session pretty quickly. But I liked hearing how he got from point A to point C. Even if the connections were fallacious, even if the premises were unsound, I wanted to hear ultimately how he got to the position that he's holding. And he lays it out reasonably well, but in doing so, he sort of like plays his entire hand of all the different things that all the different logical inconsistencies and fallacies that he uses to make himself feel better about his conclusion, which is really what it's about. It's not about necessarily him being correct, because if he can't take his conclusions and lay them out against the reality of people's lives, these people that he is demonizing in a lot of cases, and actually come back with his conclusions. Like you can propose that his conclusions are correct and then investigate those conclusions as if they're predictive models and come back with a big freaking goose egg, right? That's the whole point of this, is that he's claiming that these things that are bad are necessarily happening all the time or so frequently that they are a social ill, they're a cultural ill, and Christianity is the solution. But that's not what you find, because the people that actually do those studies don't find those things that he's complaining about. He's looking at using the sort of like the fallacy of common sense, right? That a lot of people fall back on, like, oh, I think it must be true, so it's true. And I don't know. It's not good enough for me as a skeptic. Like if I want to take somebody's marching orders in the scientific or medical communities about how I should raise my kids, I want to know that what I'm doing is actually beneficial. Like I'm not going to start like injecting my COVID sick kid with chloroquine, right? Ivermectin or whatever the drug du jour was, just because somebody that I trust in another field might say so. I want to actually see what's right, because a person can be right about one thing and wrong about 100. How do you know? And that's what skepticism is for. It's like you don't need to be a researcher, right? To understand these things. You can lean on the people that do the research and then have it vetted by their peers who would like nothing more than for their own versions of those predictive models, their own researches into the same field to be proven true. Like scientists don't set out to propose something and then be patted on the back and then be given a cookie and everything that they ever propose is correct. Like that's pie in the sky, and no scientist I've ever talked to feels that way. It's more that you find out something cool and then you see how wrong you are. And then you might be right in one way, but that just helps you narrow your focus, right? Figure out a better method for investigation, perhaps. And that you could end up with something that is inconclusive, ultimately, right? We talk about cosmology enough on here. Like, we may never have methods for investigating that first moment because we just can't. And so the best we can do is hypothesize really well, use math really, really well, use telescopes really, really well, and, get as close as we can. So, yeah, I made the list. I think we got through my entire list of the things that I found fault with in his podcast. I didn't really find anything of merit because, like you said so well, Moms, earlier, that people are all different. People will come to developmental stages in different ways at different times, I guess you could maybe call them intensity levels. Like, as individuals, we need to be taken as individuals.
I wanted to call, like, since we didn't go through the developmental stages, I just wanted to
please,
call them
no,
out.
please, you know more about that than I do.
I don't, but it's
You do.
Erik Erikson is the person who came up with them. As my mom says in her email to me about all this, Erikson was not a scientist, and he did not present the 8 stages as fact. He presented them as a theory. Mm-hmm. And another thing she brought up is that something he seemed to criticize is that Erikson came up with them via observation, mm-hmm. and that was somehow a knock on the stages.
Yeah.
I don't quite know about that. But his stages of development are infancy, trust versus mistrust, early childhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt, play age, initiative versus guilt, school age, industry versus inferiority, adolescence, identity versus confusion, early adulthood, intimacy versus isolation, middle age, generativity versus stagnation, and old age, integrity versus despair. Moms from the future again. I had to hop in because I talked with my mom more about this. And though I don't know if Pops and I were really able to pin down why a religious podcast would be so concerned with these developmental stages, my mom had a couple really great ideas. So the first thing she brought up is this whole topic of observation. And she said that for some high control religions, the point really is that knowledge is supposed to come from the top down. So she pointed out that this whole idea of building new ideas from observation could be challenging to that type of philosophy. The other interesting thing she noted, which I didn't even remember from the podcast, is that part of his criticism of the developmental stages was that children should not think about autonomy because they are supposed to be dependent on God. And this idea of developing and facing challenges might be threatening because it doesn't really talk about relying on God in that process. And finally, which I don't remember at all, but she also pointed out that at some point he talked about not needing to search for identity. So that whole concept of identity might be pinging his biases against, transgender people, people with different sexual identities than he thinks should exist. And I wonder if that's not a little bit of it too. But I just wanted to pop in with that because I thought those were all really good ideas that she had. And I was reading through these, and it just also always makes me come back to science communication and science education. And I think another issue with talking about science is that a lot of people, almost everybody, gets their information about science not from scientists for really good reasons, because scientists present their findings typically in like peer-reviewed journals in writing that most people are not good at reading or would not want to read because it's very hard to get through. I certainly don't read studies, right? So most people hear about science either from journalists talking about a study that happened or from teachers, and teachers can be wonderful at interpreting that or not. And journalists can be great at interpreting that or not. I think we've seen in recent years that in this like fast news cycle, journalists love taking the title of a study and making a big deal about it without ever really digging into the science behind it. Dan McClellan was just talking about something that a lot of religious people go to, where it's like, if you read the Bible 3 days a week or more, like your depression drops and all of this stuff. And he went back and tried to find the actual study that that's based on. And it doesn't say anything about that. They didn't like ask people to read the Bible more days a week or to increase at times they read the Bible. They just did a comparative study of like people who read the Bible a certain number of days a week and what characteristics you see in that people, which could be total correlation.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't like we're going to take people and make them read the Bible more and then see what happens. So there's no information in that study.
What part of the Bible? Yeah. Are you just going to read Job over and over again? Does that make you a well-adjusted person?
But again, if you're like taking a title or taking like one fact out of it and misrepresenting it, you're going to have a very different interpretation. Like with this thing with medicine, it just makes me think about how hard it is because most people are getting their information about science and theories and different things from like a whole host of sources that could make it really hard to parse.
Yes. And then it becomes a who do you trust sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. But that's why you can on the internet see who wrote which article, right? How many times it was cited.
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff. You can actually like vet your sources. And I was just doing a tiny bit just now, right? While you were telling us all about that, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy.
Yeah.
Because just because Erickson came up with these things and admitted like, yes, I did this through observation. I'm not a scientist, like trained scientist. Actual like researchers at, for instance, Case Western, have done a ton of research over the subsequent years into just the idea of stages of development in caps being a springboard for investigation. Oh, let's assume that there are stages of development. Perhaps let's see what they actually could be. Let's look at the ecobiological, like the biological ecology of the person, like how a person physically changes over time and how that all of those changes add up to different stages, or temperamental and psychological and mental like cognitive changes, and let's chart all of those things. And there have been a bunch of different studies, and there are now a number of different sort of sets of metrics and classifications of stages. But the point being that you have actually now real scientists, medical researchers looking into these things, coming up with perhaps differing conclusions as far as what the stages are and how to classify them. But nonetheless, seeing that there are ways that you can delineate stages of development. So whichever one you find, whichever one you attach yourself to, you can find value in it, I think, because you will be respecting that your child isn't necessarily the same as he or she was yesterday. And that, let's say at the onset of puberty, what can you expect? What sort of like temperamental, neurological, physiological changes should you expect? How can you prepare as a family? Like there are ways you can implement it without saying this one version is absolutely correct or this other version is absolutely correct. Well, the jury's still out because the jury nonetheless concludes that some version of developmental stages exist.
Do you think there's a little bit of, I think scientists cling to these theories with the dogmatism that I cling to my religion?
I think there's a lot of that. And I think that when you talk to fundamentalist Christians and apologists in particular, that they necessarily need atheism to be a religion. They necessarily need for people who disagree with them to be as dogmatic and air quotes religious as they are, because that's the lens through which they discern their world and through which they attach their ego to those like what they would consider to be brute facts about reality. And no, like that's one of the hardest things I think for these people, because I've talked to people who have come out of it over the years, and unfortunately not as common as talking to people that are still in it. But for those people, like disabusing yourself of the notion that science is dogmatic can be as hard as disabusing yourself of the fear of hell. Like it's like it is ingrained. Like you need to view the people that oppose your religious beliefs, or at least that don't necessarily say that the things that underpin your religious beliefs are factual. You need to say those people are also adhering to a religion, because then you can say, oh, well, they just are taking it on faith. But then you're throwing faith under the bus. I don't understand you, Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, when you say, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It do not compute. Sorry.
You know what does compute?
Our kids are awesome, and they're doing a great job.
And we have to make sure we get them from school.
We got a couple more minutes.
But I think should probably wrap it up there.
We can.
All right. We're going to call it there. We need to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And that wraps up this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.
I did just see something online where it was not if the does this spark joy doesn't work for you. It suggested instead, if this had poop on it.
I showed you that.
It was yours?
Yeah.
Would I clean it off or would I throw it away?
Which I feel as a parent is far more valuable, because I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
That shoe, do you really like that shoe? Or are you willing to let that shoe go?
I was just thinking about with our rodent problem. I literally went through that exercise.
Oh, we did. Oh man, that's my favorite. Like book of ElfQuest. Sorry.
Well,
I think ElfQuest actually escaped largely unscathed, but there was some stuff that I know that I saw you sigh, that existential sigh of the comet's coming. What can we do? Yeah, it's okay. It's funny what a rodent infestation will do to your pack rattiness.